There are several different ways that we can incorporate analysis services into our IT architecture. Let's first just review the different options, and then we'll look at the components that we need to include with each option separately. The simplest architecture we can set up is when we just want to build a prototype. In this case, we would set up analysis services on a server and then retrieve data just once to use in our proof of concept. In other words, we don't take the time to set up an infrastructure to repeatedly access data to keep the analysis services database up to date with fresh data. Another option is to set up a small environment for personal use or for a team. In this case, we don't really need to set up a formal data mart if we have relatively simple data, such as a single data source and if we're working with small volumes of data. And we don't need to handle all the things that a data warehouse would be set up to handle. In this case, we would need to add in a mechanism for refreshing the data in our analysis services database on a periodic basis, maybe nightly or weekly, for example. If we want to set up an environment for lots of users in a department or across the organization, then we're going to need to set up a more formal architecture. Specifically, we would definitely need to set up a relational source for analysis services, either a subject-specific data mart or a data warehouse that houses multiple data marts or consolidates data from multiple sources. In that case, we would need to set up more complex extract, transform, and load processes to keep the data mart or data warehouse up to date, and also to keep the analysis services database up to date. If we need to scale out the solution, we would also need to handle partitioning in the analysis services database, which is a feature we'll discuss in a separate course covering advanced topics. Now let's take a look at each architecture individually, starting with the prototype architecture. In this case, we'd have a data source. We'd need to have data available in a relational database, probably SQL Server. And of course, we'd have an instance of analysis services installed, possibly on the same server as the data source. If this is just a prototype, we could use the Developer Edition, but if we think the prototype will evolve into a permanent solution, we can use either Standard Edition or Enterprise Edition, depending on which features we'll need to implement. I'll point out Enterprise Edition features where applicable throughout this course. Then we'll have some client tool for browsing the cube. For prototyping purposes, Excel 2007 or higher is usually sufficient. Once we move past the prototype stage, we need to automate the process of keeping data current in analysis services. With this option, we still have a data source, and we have analysis services in place like we did in the prototype architecture. But this time, we also have integration services which we can use to run a package on a scheduled basis to update analysis services. And we still need a tool for cube browsing, and Excel is still a popular choice in the personal or team use architecture, but we might also set up reporting services to have standard reports that use analysis services as a data source. When we set up analysis services for organizational use, we again have a data source available to analysis services, but this time we have a data mart or data warehouse in place, which we use as a source for the data that gets loaded into analysis services. We use integration services to keep the data mart updated on a periodic basis, and also to update analysis services from the data mart. Then we can add in the client tools, which can be a cube browser like Excel, or a reporting tool like Reporting Services, or SharePoint, which could include Excel services, SharePoint status indicators and dashboards, or Performance Point scorecards and dashboards.